So as I said earlier, I'd like to continue our series, Things That You Can Get Wrong Reading the Bible, and today we're talking about creation. So we read in those very first few verses of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And what I noticed this time through reading this familiar story is that there is very little detail given in the creation story about the heavens. Certainly we have the sun, the moon and the stars, but what mention is there of planets and asteroids and black holes? And why is that? Well, the reason I feel is that it is the earth that we are most closely aware of. And those things that we see mentioned that are created in the heavens are the things that have an impact here on earth. They are the things that we are aware of. Having said that, it is always the heavens who are mentioned first, both in Genesis here and as we heard Darren read, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered or come to mind." And this occurs throughout the word. The heavens, though we know little about them, are mentioned first. Now, I've no real wish today to dive into the creation-evolution debate. That one has been well done, I think, by many others. What I want to highlight today is the meaning of the creation. You see, the Bible is a spiritual book, and a belief in this or that method of creation really is of no spiritual benefit to us. You remember a few weeks ago I quoted this passage, and I dare say I'll quote it many times again later on, from the second book of Timothy by the Apostle Paul. "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work." You see, the purpose of the Bible is not to tell us about the natural world. We're perfectly capable of doing that ourselves. The purpose of the Bible is to tell us about the spiritual world. And although we know very little about the heavens in actual fact, they are present throughout creation, because it is because of the heavens that the natural world, the earth, continues in existence. The heavens are the means by which earth is created. The means of creation is spiritual and not natural. Now, I'd like to share with you a passage from the teachings of our church, and this comes from the book Heaven and Hell. And Swedenborg writes this: "All things that come into existence in nature, from the least to the greatest, are correspondences. They are correspondences because the natural world, with all things that belong to it, comes into existence and continues in existence from the spiritual world, and both worlds from the divine. It is said to continue in existence also because everything continues in existence by virtue of that from which it comes into existence. For continuing in existence is a perpetual coming into existence. And because not a thing can continue in existence from itself, but from something prior to itself, thus from the first. Therefore, if separated from it, it would utterly perish and vanish." Those are two quite remarkable statements. And if Jesus is right when he says the kingdom of God is within you, it leads us to a startling realization. And that realization is both empowering and deeply challenging. If the natural world exists and continues in existence from the spiritual world, and if the spiritual world is inside of us, then we are co-creators of the natural world that we inhabit. We have agency, that is, we are actors and shapers of our reality, not merely victims and pawns in some grand struggle that we have no ultimate say or determination over. So often we look at the circumstances of life, we look at the people that we meet and come into contact with, and we seem to ourselves to be victims of those circumstances. And we find ourselves strangely comforted by that appearance, because when we believe ourselves victims, we hold ourselves unaccountable. We are not responsible for the situations we find ourselves in. And this is why I say that this truth is deeply challenging, because it requires us to act. Everything exists and continues it to exist because I continue to participate in what sustains it. So I want to present to you my challenge for today. It is this: change your attitudes and beliefs to change your world. Why can I even ask this of you? Well, I want to give you some examples and show you, in actual fact, how real this is, because many of you, I'm sure, sitting here, watching me, listening to me, will say, "No, David, you're talking a load of rubbish." I remember a number of years ago, early on in our days in Canberra, going to Parliament House and taking my parents to Parliament House. Now, my father, many of you will know, is a practical man, and we were wandering around Parliament House, and he pointed out to me the woodwork in Parliament House, and you'll notice it here. This is the Senate chamber, and if you'll notice all the wood panelling and the wood that's been used to create the furniture here. He pointed to a lot of this timber as being called red box gum. And he said the reason it's called red box gum is when the first settlers came to Australia, they looked at these trees, and they were looking obviously for resources to build, and they chopped these trees down and they milled them into timber, and they found them very difficult to work with. They didn't, the traditional means of working with timber just did not work with this type of wood. And for many, many years, it was regarded as only suitable for making boxes, and that is why it's called red box timber. But as years went by and people started discovering new ways of working with timber, they found the beauty that could be seen in this timber when it is worked well and worked properly. And it's indicative to me of the way in which the early settlers viewed this land that we lived in as barren and unproductive, that there was nothing of value growing here. And so what they did, of course, was to import very many of the species that they were familiar with. They imported rabbits for food, they imported foxes for hunting, and we know now, after 2 centuries of living in this country, the devastation that those 2 species alone have caused because of our blindness to the reality of this continent. Many of you will have seen in the news, only in the last couple of weeks, the story of this little boy, known as AJ. AJ disappeared into bushland near his home and was missing for several days. And of course, as the searchers went on looking for this little boy in dense bushland, they became increasingly agitated and despaired that this little boy could survive so long on his own in the bush. And so a few days after he disappeared, when a police helicopter happened to spot him sitting in a stream, there of course was great rejoicing, and there was great wonderment as to why this little boy, who is autistic, could survive in the bush for 3 days on his own. And I read an article a few days ago that suggested that it was his autistic nature, in actual fact, that saved him. Because an ordinary child, like many of us, lost in the bush, would panic. But AJ, because of his autism, did not. He slept when he felt tired. He sought water when he was thirsty. And of course, he was very hungry by the time that he got home. But none of these things disturbed him because he had a different attitude to life than many so-called normal children. His sense of time was absent, when many of us would panic the longer and longer we were out, stranded and lost in the bush. And it's indicative of the way his attitudes and beliefs about life actually saved him. I can mention in my own life a number of instances where changing my attitudes and beliefs have utterly transformed the reality that I found myself in. I want only to cite 3 examples for you this morning. The first is my first year of teaching. I had my worst class on a Friday afternoon. Now you can well imagine at the end of a week, Friday afternoon, you're ready to go home, you've had enough already, and I am confronted with my worst class, 8M4 they were called, and all year I struggled to control that class and teach them anything of value. There was one day when I managed it, and that one day was the day when Pam had rung me at lunchtime to say that she was indeed pregnant with our first child. And I determined at that point not to allow the afternoon's happenings, whatever they were, to get me down. And in actual fact, on that one day, I succeeded. I have seen, friends, the power of speaking softly to people to calm someone down. I remember an incident that I've mentioned to many of you before where a motorcyclist was almost run off the road by a truck driver, and I was sitting in the cab of this truck. Obviously the motorcyclist was agitated, and you can understand why. Everybody pulled over, and of course there was quite a confrontation between the motorcyclist and the driver of the truck. And the driver of the truck just spoke softly and gently to this man, this agitated man. He apologized because he recognized he was in the wrong. And we all left the scene of that incident that day much, much calmer than we could have. The power of speaking softly in difficult circumstances. And I can attest myself to the power of listening. You know, we have our opinions about things as they should go in the world, or our opinions about all sorts of matters which we disagree with the people that we meet. And our natural reaction is to force our point of view upon others, to get agitated and raise our voices in frustration that people are not listening to us. But I have observed the power of listening. That sometimes when you speak to people and they have opposing views to your own, that simply listening to them, allowing them to express their views, sometimes those people actually change their mind. They talk themselves around to another way of thinking. So change your attitudes and beliefs to change your world. Now, how can you demand the world change indeed if you yourself are not prepared to? But I can imagine you saying, but David, I'm right, and I have every right to be offended or upset about what happens. Well, let me share with you one of my favourite passages from the teachings of the Church. In Arcana Celestia, where Swedenborg is talking about the story of Noah. If you remember, Noah, after the flood, plants a vineyard and gets drunk. And in talking about this story, he refers to the nature of angels. That angels go out of their way to seek the good in others. And if they cannot find it, they excuse the bad that they do see. Now we look at this attitude and we think it is naive. Or you might say, well, you're fooling yourself. Well, here's the thing. You see, the proprium, our selfhood, makes up stories about people all the time. If you meet someone with an opposing opinion, how easy it is for you to make up a story about what it is that motivates them. When someone reacts badly to you, how easy it is for you to invent a story about why they're doing this, why are they punishing me, why are they making my life difficult, are they intending me harm? How easy it is for our selfhood to make up those stories. Why not turn that around and make up a story which supports something good in that person's life? You see, the worldly view, the worldly attitude is to look for the evil out there, the evil in others, and see only good in oneself. The heavenly view does the opposite. The heavenly view sees the evil that is present in me and looks for the good out there. We rail and we complain about injustice in the world. We love to blame those around us for maintaining a corrupt system. But this is an illusion of the senses. It is an illusion of the selfhood. So many people look to a physical coming of the Lord in a spectacular fashion to end all suffering and injustices. But that, my friends, would not be a spiritual event. That would be a natural one. That would be an external event. It would not allow us to examine our own lives and find the evils within our own lives that support those injustices. And that is what the Word calls us to do. We have this attitude that people ought to treat us well, and if they treat us well, then we will reciprocate and treat them well. But that is against true order. The Golden Rule, as you all know, states this: and just as you want men to do to you, you do also to them likewise. Now, what we do in our natural way is we turn that on its head, we flip it around. We expect others to behave in a certain way, and then we will behave well, as I said. But that is wrong. You see, Jesus continues with this: but if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. Our actions towards others must derive from their existence within ourselves, not from the actions of others towards us. Just a few verses on in that chapter in Luke, Jesus says, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." If you want to change the world, change what is within you that maintains and supports the world as it is. I want to just take a brief aside about helping others. When we seek to help others to change their reality, one of the things we have to remember is that whilst we have influence over their lives, we do not have control. So we may point out to someone the things that will make them happy, the things that will bring their world back into order, but we cannot make them live that life. We have influence, but not control. So you can point someone in the right direction, you can lead them by example, but you cannot make them live in such a way that their life becomes orderly and happy. And that's a difficult pill for us to swallow. So having said all of that, I wonder whether you believe me. I wonder whether you truly believe that changing your attitudes and beliefs can change your world. And so I'm going to ask you to test it. When you find yourself rattled by a personal encounter with someone, or by circumstances out in the world that you feel are beyond your control, I'm going to ask you to change your attitudes and beliefs and see what effect that has upon this circumstance that you are speaking of. Consider how you could act or react differently to these circumstances. Can you do it differently to your default position, the thing that you would normally, regularly and without thinking do? Can you change your course of action? Because as I said earlier, if you are unable to change, if you are unwilling to change, then you cannot expect the world and those around you to change to satisfy your wants.